Okay, this is a continuation of Manly P. Hall's Initiates of the Flame. We're going into chapter 4. This is the Egyptian Initiate. Many ages have elapsed since the Egyptian priest king passed through the pillars of Thebes. Ages before the sinking of Atlantis, thousands of years before the Christian era, Egypt was a land of great truths. The hand of the great white brotherhood was held out to the empire of the Nile, and the ancient pyramid passages resounded with the chants of the initiates. It was then that the pharaoh, now called half human, half divine, reigned in ancient Egypt. Pharaoh is the Egyptian word for king. Many of the later pharaohs were degenerate and of little account. It is only the early pharaohs we now list among the priest kings. Try to picture for a moment the great hall of Luxor, its inscriptive columns holding up domes of solid granite, each column carved with the histories of the gods. There at the upper end of the chamber sat the pharaoh of the Nile in his robes of state, around him his counselors, chief among them the priest of the temple. An imposing spectacle it was, the gigantic frame of the latter Atlantean, robed in gold and priceless jewels. On his head the crown of the north and south, the double empire of the ancient. On his forehead the coiled serpent of the initiate. The serpent which was raised in the wilderness, that all who looked upon it might live. That sleeping serpent power in man, which coiled, head downward, around the tree of life, drove him from the garden of the Lord, but which raised upon the cross became the symbol of the Christ. The encircled serpent is the crown of the ancient gods. Excuse me. The encircled serpent is the crown of the ancient gods. It shows that the two paths or parts of the spirit fire have been united. This crown is the symbol of mastery, and the union takes place within the serpent when the life forces are lifted to the brain. The pharaoh was an initiate of Scorpio, and the serpent is the transmuted Scorpio energy, which working upward in the regenerated individual is called the Kundalini. This serpent was the sign of the initiation. It meant that within him the serpent has been raised. For the true pharaoh was a priest of God, as well as a master of men. There he sat upon the cube altar throne, indicating his mastery over the four elements of his physical body, a judge of the living and of the dead, who in spite of all his power and glory, having about him the grandeur of the world's greatest empire, still bowed in humble supplication to the will of the gods. In his hands he carried the triple scepter of the Nile, the shepherd's crook, the Anubis-headed staff, and the flail or whip. These were the symbols of his work. They represent the powers which he had mastered. With the whip he had subjugated his physical body. With the shepherd's crook he was the guardian and the keeper of his emotional body. With the Anubis-headed staff he was the master of his mind and worthy to wield the powers of government over others, because, first of all, he obeyed the laws himself. With all his robes of state, and with the scarab upon his breast, and with the all-seeing eye above his throne, there was still nothing as precious or as sacred to the ancient Egyptian priest-king as the triangular girdle, or apron, which was the symbol of his initiation. The apron of the ancient Egyptian carried with it the same symbolism as the Masonic apron of today. It symbolized the purification of the bodies when the seat of the lower emotions, Scorpio, was covered by the white sheepskin of purification. This symbol of his purification was the most precious belonging of the ancient pharaoh, and this plain insignia, worn by many others below him in rank and dignity, but equal to him in spiritual purification, was the most precious of all things to the priest-king. There he sat, written upon him in the words of the initiates. There he sat, written upon him in the words of the initiate, the symbols of his purification and mastery, a wise king of a wise people. And it was through this priest kings, it was through these priest kings that the divine worked, and they were of the order of Melchizedek. Through them was formed that doctrine which degeneracy has not been able to entirely obliterate, which we know as the divine right of kings. Divine because through spirituality and growth, God was able to manifest through them. They were conscious instruments in the hands of a ready writer, willing and proud to do the work of those with whom through knowledge and truth they had attuned themselves. But with time came, as in all nations, when selfishness and egotism entered the heart of the king and people alike, and slowly the hand of the great white brotherhood that fed ancient Egypt was withdrawn, and the powers of darkness transformed the land of glory into one of ruins, and the names of the mighty kings were buried beneath the oblivion of degeneracy. Mighty cataclysms shook the world, and out of the land of the darkness the great white brotherhood carried the chosen people into the promised land. Egypt, the land of glory, disintegrated into dust. The great temples of the pharaohs are ruins, and the temple of Isis are but broken heaps of sandstone. But what of the priest kings who labored there in the days of its glory? They are still with us, for those who were leaders before are leaders now. If they have continued to walk the path. Dig that? That's the key there, though. They are still with us, for those who are leaders before are leaders now, if they have continued to walk the path. Although his scepter is gone and his priestly vestments have molded away, the priest king still walks the earth with dignity and the power and the childish simplicity that before made him great. He no longer wears the robes of his order. Although he bears no credentials, he is much a priest king now as then, for he still bears the true insignia of his rank. The coiled serpent has given place to knowledge and love. The hand that bestowed the riches of the past does little acts of kindness now. Although he no longer carries the scepters of self-mastery, still he manifests that mastery in his daily life. Although the altar fires within the temple at Karnak have long been dead, the true fire within himself still burns, and before that he still bows as he bowed in the days of Egypt's glory. Although the priest no longer is his counselor, and the wise ones of his country no longer aid him in governmental problems, still he is never alone, for the priest in white and the counselors in blue still march with him and whisper words of strength when he needs them. Have you seen people that somehow you liked regardless of appearances? Have you seen other charming people whom you hated in spite of their charms? Have you learned people who were fools or impressed you as much, or people who knew little and yet you felt were wise? Those are the insignia of rank, which the loss of title or position cannot destroy. Kings with or without crowns they are, not puppets dressed in tawdry tinsel, and they are still kings and will be to the end of time, and they still manifest their rank, not by their superiority and their high-headedness, but by the soul qualities which they radiate from themselves. The purity of their lives still radiates outward from those who wore the apron of the initiate. For while the triangular apron with its serpent drawn upon it has long since rotted away, still the spiritual counterpart of that symbol radiates in their daily lives, proving beyond all dispute that they are priest kings and are today. We find them in every walk of life, in high places, and down in the mire of life. But wherever we find them, they are still the mouthpieces of the gods, and through them come the promises. Excuse me. And through them comes the promise to all who strive. They are kings, not of the earth but of heavens, and in the life of our masters we find one who joined himself to those who served, and was a true king, even when his only crown was a wreath of thorns. Still, in the invisible ether about the pyramid of Giza, the initiates continue. Still the initiate receives the insignia of his rank. Before that fire within himself he makes his vows, and upon the burning altar of his own higher being he lays his crown and his scepter, his robes and his diamonds, his hates and his fears, and sanctifies his life as a priest king, and swearing to serve none but his own higher self. And that is the end of chapter 4. And we'll catch up on the next one. Thanks, y'all.